Grizzly bears are nature's unforgiving enforcers, massive, territorial, and terrifyingly fast. Armed with bone-crushing jaws and claws built to kill, they rule the wild with brute force. When humans cross into their domain, survival often comes down to seconds. In this video, we'll explore 6 real-life encounters, from remote logging roads to the frozen silence of the Arctic, where grizzlies struck without warning, leaving behind blood, fear, and unforgettable stories of survival. In the dense forests of Sakhalin Island, Russia, during the autumn of 1987, the Soviet logging operations had carved deep wounds into the wilderness. The island, a remote stretch of land caught between the Sea of Okhotsk and the Tartar Strait, had become a final frontier for Soviet resource extraction. Local hunting permits were difficult to obtain, but Sergei Karpov had connections through his work at the regional forestry department. The taiga stretched endlessly in all directions, populated by some of the largest brown bears on Earth, creatures that could weigh over 800 pounds and stand 9 feet tall on their hind legs. Sergei Karpov, a 34-year-old forestry supervisor from Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, had been planning this hunting expedition for months. His cousin Ivan Volkov, 6 years younger and less experienced, agreed to accompany him despite his wife's protests. Both men carried aging Mosin Nagant rifles, a standard issue from their military service years earlier. The October weather had turned bitter, with morning frost coating the birch leaves and making the forest floor treacherous underfoot. They had been tracking the massive Russian grizzly for 3 days, following a trail of claw marks on trees and enormous paw prints in the muddy creek beds. The bear they pursued was legendary among local hunters, a male that locals claimed had killed at least 2 other bears defending its territory. Fresh salmon runs had drawn the creature to the Tim River system, where it had been gorging itself in preparation for winter hibernation. On October 15th, Sergei finally spotted the bear through his binoculars. The animal stood chest-deep in the rushing water, methodically catching salmon with powerful swipes of its massive paws. Ivan estimated the bear's weight to be nearly 700 pounds, with a distinctive white patch across its chest and scars along its muzzle from previous fights. The creature's fur appeared almost black in the morning shadows, and its movements displayed the casual confidence of an apex predator. Sergei took careful aim from their position 150 meters upstream, steadying his rifle against a fallen log. The shot echoed through the valley like thunder, and the bear immediately reared up on its hind legs, roaring in pain and fury. Blood streamed from a wound in its shoulder, but the bullet had failed to penetrate deeply enough to cause fatal damage. The injured animal crashed through the shallow water and disappeared into dense alder bushes. Ivan argued they should wait for the bear to weaken from blood loss, but Sergei's competitive nature overrode his caution. He insisted that wounded bears were dangerous to leave alive, especially with winter approaching and the animal likely to become more desperate. Against Ivan's increasingly vocal objections, Sergei immediately tracks the bear, while the blood trail remains fresh. The cousins separated at the edge of the thicket, with Ivan positioned to cover the eastern approach while Sergei pushed through the tangled undergrowth from the west. The blood trail led deeper into the maze of fallen trees and dense vegetation, where visibility dropped to less than 10 feet in any direction. Sergei moved slowly, checking every shadow and listening for the slightest sound that might indicate the bear's location. 20 minutes into his solo pursuit, Sergei heard a low growling sound directly ahead. He raised his rifle and peered through the scope, trying to locate the noise source. The wounded bear had doubled back through the thicket and positioned itself behind a massive pile of deadfall, using the natural fortification to its advantage. It was too late to retreat when Sergei finally spotted the creature's dark form. With surprising speed, the grizzly exploded from its hiding place for such a massive animal. Despite its shoulder wound, the bear covered the 30-foot distance in less than 3 seconds, crashing through the undergrowth like a living avalanche. Sergei managed to fire one hasty shot wide before the bear's full weight slammed into his chest, driving him backward into a cluster of young birch trees. Ivan heard his cousin's screams from his position 50 meters away and immediately began crashing through the brush toward the sound. He arrived to find Sergei pinned beneath the bear, which was using its massive paws to hold him down while attempting to bite his head and neck. The forestry supervisor's rifle had been knocked from his hands during the initial impact and lay several feet away in the mud. The desperate struggle continued for what Ivan later described as the longest minute of his life. Sergei managed to grab a thick branch and struck the bear repeatedly across its snout, which only seemed to increase the animal's fury. During the violent thrashing, the bear's massive paw stepped directly onto the trigger guard of Sergei's dropped rifle, somehow managing to discharge the weapon. The bullet struck Sergei in his upper thigh, severing his femoral artery. Ivan finally found a clear shot and fired his rifle at the bear's torso, striking it in the ribs. The impact caused the animal to release Sergei and focus on this new threat. Ivan fired 2 more shots in rapid succession, both finding their mark, and the wounded bear finally retreated deeper into the forest, leaving a heavy blood trail behind. Sergei lay motionless in the bloodied mud, conscious but rapidly losing blood from both the bear attack and the accidental gunshot wound. Ivan applied pressure to the leg wound, using strips torn from his jacket, but the damage was severe. The nearest road lay 12 kilometers away through difficult terrain, and Ivan's handheld radio had been damaged during his frantic rush through the undergrowth. Using a backup emergency radio from Sergei's pack, Ivan contacted the forestry station in Voronezh. He provided their coordinates and described his cousin's condition in increasingly panicked transmissions. The rescue helicopter faced delays due to deteriorating weather conditions, and ground crews would require several hours to reach their remote location. Ivan spent those agonizing hours trying to keep Sergei conscious and warm, building a small fire and continuing to apply pressure to his wounds. His cousin drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling about the bear's eyes and how they had seemed almost intelligent during the attack. The October temperatures dropped steadily as afternoon turned to evening. The rescue helicopter finally arrived at dusk, guided by Ivan's signal flares and the smoke from their fire. Medical personnel immediately began treating Sergei's injuries, but the combination of blood loss, shock, and hypothermia had taken its toll. Despite their efforts during the flight to the regional hospital in Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, Sergei Karpov died from his injuries just before midnight on October 15, 1987. Ivan's detailed account to Soviet authorities and later to local journalists painted a chilling picture of how quickly the hunt had turned deadly. The wounded bear had demonstrated remarkable cunning in setting up its ambush, and the accidental discharge of Sergei's rifle added a tragic irony to the encounter. Wildlife officials eventually tracked and killed the injured bear 3 days later, finding it had succumbed to its wounds in a cave approximately 2 kilometers from the attack site. The incident quickly became a grim cautionary tale among Sakhalin's hunting community, whispered around campfires and passed down as a warning to newcomers. As for Ivan, he never picked up a rifle again. He returned quietly to his old job as a mechanic in Voronezh, but those who knew him said he was never quite the same. He avoided conversations about the forest entirely, and when the topic came up, his face would pale, his hands would tremble, and a distant, haunted look would cloud his eyes. No matter how often he was asked, he refused every invitation to join another hunt. What he saw in the woods stayed with him, and it never let go. In the dense wilderness of British Columbia, Canada, during the summer of 1994, the provincial government had suspended most logging operations in the Clayoquot Sound region following massive environmental protests. Abandoned logging roads snaked through the coastal temperate rainforest like forgotten arteries, slowly being reclaimed by towering Douglas firs and thick undergrowth. The area had become a no-man's land where wildlife flourished without human activity, creating perfect conditions for dangerous encounters. Luke Patterson, 16, and his younger brother Mason, 14, lived with their volatile stepfather in the logging town of Port Alberni. Their mother worked double shifts at the local mill, leaving the brothers to navigate an increasingly hostile home environment. Their stepfather, a former logger named Dale, had turned to heavy drinking after losing his job in the industry downturn. His old pickup truck sat unused in their driveway most days. On July 23, 1994, after another violent argument that left Dale passed out on the living room floor, the brothers decided to escape into the wilderness. Luke had recently obtained his learner's permit and convinced Mason they should take the truck for an adventure in the abandoned logging territory north of town. They loaded Dale's old hunting rifle in a beer cooler, planning to hunt rabbits and spend a night away from their troubled home. The brothers drove deep into the Clayoquot backcountry along deteriorating logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance vehicles in over 2 years. Ancient cedars pressed close to the narrow tracks, their massive trunks scarred by decades of industrial activity. They set up camp near an old logging bridge where Kennedy River flowed beneath rotting timber supports, the sound of rushing water masking most other forest noises. At dawn on July 24th, Mason discovered fresh claw marks gouged deep into the bark of nearby trees. The scratches stood nearly 8 feet high and appeared to have been made recently. Luke examined the marks with teenage bravado, declaring they would track whatever animal had made them and photograph it for their friends back in town. Armed with Dale's rifle and a disposable camera, the brothers followed a game trail down a narrow access road. The trail led them to a natural clearing where they discovered a massive grizzly bear feeding on a moose carcass. The bear stood approximately 7 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed what Mason later estimated to be over 600 pounds. Its dark brown fur was matted with blood from its feast, and flies buzzed around the partially consumed moose. The brothers crouched behind a fallen log, with Luke insisting on getting closer for better photographs. Against Mason's whispered objections, Luke crept within 30 feet of the feeding bear and raised his camera. The electronic flash fired automatically in the dim forest light, creating a brilliant burst that immediately caught the grizzly's attention. The massive animal raised its head, located the source of the disturbance, and charged without hesitation. Mason fired a warning shot with their stepfather's rifle, but their inexperience with the weapon caused the bullet to sail harmlessly over the bear's head. The grizzly covered the distance to Luke in seconds, tackling the teenager and dragging him toward the thick underbrush. Luke's screams echoed through the forest as the bear shook him like a rag doll before disappearing into the dense vegetation. Panicked and alone, Mason climbed the nearest suitable tree and spent the next hour calling for his brother. The forest had fallen silent except for the distant sound of breaking branches and occasional animal noises from the direction where Luke had vanished. When the bear finally emerged from the underbrush and wandered away from the area, Mason climbed down to search for his brother. During their hasty arrival, the truck had become hopelessly mired in mud, and Mason's attempts to start it only resulted in spinning tires and a dead battery. With no other options, he began the long walk back toward civilization, following the logging road system he hoped would eventually connect to the main highway. 12 miles later, Mason reached a forestry station where he collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. Rangers immediately organized a search and rescue operation, using helicopters to scan the dense forest canopy for signs of Luke or the bear. They found Luke 3 hours later, unconscious but alive, near the moose carcass site. The bear attack had torn away a large portion of Luke's scalp and left deep puncture wounds across his back and shoulders. Emergency medical treatment stabilized his condition, and helicopter evacuation transported him to a general hospital in Vancouver. Reconstructive surgery repaired most of the damage, though Luke carried permanent scars and partial hearing loss from the encounter. In the aftermath, provincial authorities responded by posting stark warning signs throughout the abandoned logging roads. Bold red lettering meant to ward off curious hikers and reckless hunters. But the brothers never spoke publicly about what happened in those woods. Whatever they endured, it left scars far deeper than anyone could see. Luke's physical wounds eventually healed, but the trauma ran deeper. He developed severe agoraphobia, unable to set foot in forests or wide-open spaces without spiraling into panic. The mere sound of wind through trees would send him into cold sweats. Mason, once the more outgoing of the two, finished high school early and left town in silence. He moved to Toronto, throwing himself into the noise and steel of urban construction, surrounded by concrete, far from the wilderness. Friends and co-workers said he never camped, never hiked, and never once joined them on trips outside the city. Mason stayed grounded in pavement and shadows for the rest of his life, as if fearing the wild might somehow find him again. In the remote coastal wilderness of Kodiak Island, Alaska, during September 2001, bush plane crashes were unfortunately common due to the region's unpredictable weather patterns and challenging terrain. The island, home to the world's largest brown bears, stretched across 3,600 square miles of rugged mountains, dense forests, and treacherous coastlines. Emergency response teams faced significant challenges reaching crash sites, often requiring days to locate and extract survivors from the island's most remote areas. Reese Donovan, a 31-year-old wilderness emergency medical technician based in Kodiak City, had built a reputation for solo rescue operations in terrain too dangerous for helicopter landings. Her military background and extensive wilderness training made her the go-to responder for the most challenging situations. On September 18, 2001, she received an emergency beacon signal from a Cessna 185 that had disappeared during a biological survey flight the previous evening. The plane had been carrying Cal Morrison, a 26-year-old marine biologist from an Alaska university, researching salmon spawning patterns in the island's remote creek systems. His flight plan indicated a route along the island's southwestern coast, but deteriorating weather conditions had forced the aircraft off course before radio contact was lost. The emergency locator beacon placed the crash site in a valley approximately 15 miles from the nearest accessible landing zone. Reese hiked through dense alder thickets and across unstable scree slopes, following GPS coordinates toward the beacon signal. The September weather had turned cold and wet, with intermittent rain showers creating slippery conditions on the steep terrain. After 6 hours of difficult travel, she located the wreckage in a narrow valley surrounded by towering spruce trees and thick undergrowth. The small aircraft had impacted nose first into a cluster of large boulders, crushing the engine compartment and trapping Cal beneath twisted metal and debris. He remained conscious, but had suffered significant blood loss from lacerations across his legs and torso. The fuel tanks had ruptured during impact, saturating the surrounding area with aviation gasoline and creating a strong chemical odor that mixed with the metallic smell of blood. While Reese worked to stabilize Cal's injuries and administer pain medication, she noticed massive bear tracks in the soft earth around the crash site. The prints measured over 12 inches long and showed the distinctive claw marks of a large Kodiak brown bear. Fresh scat nearby indicated the animal had been in the area recently, likely drawn by the unusual sounds and smells from the accident. As Reese prepared to extract Cal from the wreckage using her emergency tools, a massive Kodiak bear emerged from the tree line approximately 50 yards away. The animal stood nearly 10 feet tall when it reared up on its hind legs to examine the crash scene. Its coat appeared almost golden in the filtered sunlight, and Reese estimated its weight at over 900 pounds based on its massive shoulders and thick build. The bear approached slowly, investigating the strong fuel and blood scents permeating the area. Reese fired a bear banger from her emergency kit, creating a loud explosive sound to frighten wildlife. Instead of retreating, the curious bear moved closer, apparently unimpressed by the noise. When it began a determined charge toward their position, Reese positioned herself between the animal and the injured biologist. A second explosive crack echoed from the ridge above them, followed immediately by another gunshot. Jake Morrison, a fire lookout ranger tracking their emergency beacon from his nearby tower, arrived with his rifle just as the situation turned critical. His warning shots caused the massive bear to veer away from Reese and Cal, though the animal remained in the immediate area, rather than fleeing entirely. The trio spent the next 2 hours crouched behind the aircraft wreckage while the bear circled their position, occasionally approaching within 20 feet, before Jake fired another warning shot. The animal's behavior seemed more curious than aggressive, but its massive size and unpredictable movements kept them pinned down. Reese continued treating Cal's injuries while monitoring radio communications with the incoming rescue helicopter. When the medevac helicopter finally arrived, Its rotor wash and engine noise convinced the bear to retreat into the forest. The crew successfully extracted Cal, and emergency treatment during the flight to Anchorage saved his life. The marine biologist required multiple surgeries, but completely recovered within 6 months. In Kodiak City, local media hailed Reese as a hero for her successful rescue under dangerous conditions. However, she found herself troubled by recurring dreams about the encounter. The bear's behavior had seemed less like typical wildlife aggression and more like a calculated assessment of the situation. Its eyes had appeared almost intelligent during their standoff, as though the animal was studying them rather than simply reacting to their presence. The incident report noted that Kodiak bears were becoming increasingly bold around human activity, possibly due to changes in their traditional food sources. Wildlife officials recommended enhanced bear safety protocols for emergency responders, but the crash site remained a reminder of how quickly routine rescue operations could turn deadly in Alaska's wilderness. Reese continued her work as a wilderness EMT, but always carried extra bear deterrence and maintained heightened awareness during solo operations in bear country. In the rugged Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho during August 2008, ultramarathon trail running had become increasingly popular among endurance athletes seeking extreme challenges. The Bitterroot Wilderness stretched across nearly 160,000 acres of pristine alpine terrain, featuring steep mountain passes, dense forests, and remote valleys where grizzly bears had recently begun returning after decades of absence. The isolation and lack of cell phone coverage made it attractive to serious runners and potentially dangerous for those unprepared for wildlife encounters. Ty Kowalski, a 29-year-old software engineer from Boise, and Lena Martinez, a 27-year-old physical therapist from Missoula, had been training partners for over 3 years. Both were accomplished ultra-marathoners preparing for Colorado's grueling 100-mile endurance run. Their friendship had developed through countless hours of shared suffering on mountain trails, and they had become known in the ultra-running community for their meticulous preparation and safety-conscious approach to backcountry training. Their final practice run before the race was planned as a challenging 36-mile loop through the southern Bitterroots, following a route that would take them from the Painted Rocks Lake trailhead to the Continental Divide and back. The August weather had been unusually hot and dry, creating perfect running conditions and increasing wildfire danger throughout the region. They carried minimal gear to simulate race conditions: hydration packs, emergency food, and Lena's GPS tracking device for safety. On August 23, 2008, they began their run at dawn, maintaining a conservative pace through the initial valley approach. The trail climbed steadily through dense lodgepole pine forests and across alpine meadows filled with wildflowers. By afternoon, they had covered 26 miles and were descending toward a remote creek crossing when Lena noticed unusual disturbances in the vegetation alongside the trail. A shallow depression in the soft earth among a cluster of huckleberry bushes caught her attention. The area showed clear signs of recent use, with flattened grass and broken branches forming what appeared to be a large animal's resting spot. Based on the fresh scent markings on nearby trees, Ty identified the site as a grizzly bear daybed, likely used within the past day or two. With approximately 10 miles remaining to complete their loop, the runners faced a difficult decision. Backtracking would add significant distance and time to their run, potentially forcing them to navigate the final descent in darkness. Lena argued they should retreat immediately, while Ty insisted they could move through the area quickly and quietly, without disturbing any wildlife that might be nearby. Their debate was settled when a massive grizzly bear exploded from the thick undergrowth less than 30 yards ahead. The animal appeared to have been foraging in a patch of ripe huckleberries when their conversation disturbed its feeding. Standing nearly 8 feet tall when it reared up to identify the threat, the bear displayed the distinctive shoulder hump and dished face profile of a mature grizzly. Ty froze in place according to standard bear safety protocols, but Lena's runner's instincts overrode her training. She screamed and ran down the trail at full speed, triggering the bear's chase response. The grizzly dropped to all fours and pursued her with surprising speed for such a massive animal, quickly closing the distance despite Lena's competitive running ability. The bear tackled Lena after approximately 200 yards, using its massive paws to pin her face down on the rocky trail. The attack was brief but devastating, with the animal focusing on her head and neck area before suddenly abandoning its victim and disappearing back into the forest. Ty reached her location minutes later to find Lena unconscious and bleeding heavily from multiple wounds. In shock and operating on pure adrenaline, Ty activated Lena's GPS tracking device and began the desperate 10-mile run to the trailhead for help. His training shoes disintegrated on the rocky terrain, forcing him to complete the final miles barefoot across sharp stones and loose scree. Dehydration and psychological trauma caused him to hallucinate during the descent, imagining he could hear Lena calling for help behind him. Ty reached the Painted Rocks Lake parking area after dark and immediately drove to the nearest ranger station, where he collapsed while trying to explain what had happened. Search and rescue teams used the GPS coordinates to locate Lena by helicopter, but she had succumbed to her injuries before they arrived. The bear was never found despite extensive tracking efforts by wildlife officials. Following the incident, the trail system was officially closed for the remainder of the season. Ty attempted to honor Lena's memory by completing the 100 race several months later, running silently while wearing her GPS tracker strapped to his ankle. He finished the race but refused all interview requests and withdrew from competitive running afterward. The attack highlighted growing concerns about grizzly bear recovery in Idaho and the risks faced by backcountry recreationists in newly recolonized habitat. Wildlife managers implemented new warning systems for popular trail areas, but the remote nature of the Bitterroot Wilderness continued to pose challenges for wildlife management and emergency response. Ty eventually moved to Denver, where he worked in software development and avoided mountain running entirely. However, colleagues noted he wore Lena's GPS tracker during his rare urban training runs. In suburban Colorado during the autumn of 2015, the wildland-urban interface had become a battleground between expanding human development and recovering wildlife populations. A national forest in north-central Colorado borders dozens of affluent communities where retirees and remote workers have built expensive homes among the ponderosa pines and aspen groves. Local real estate marketed these properties as offering authentic mountain living experiences, but many new residents lacked understanding of the wildlife management challenges that came with their scenic locations. Elaine Crawford, a 58-year-old retired marketing executive, and her husband Dave, a 61-year-old former aerospace engineer, had purchased their dream home near Nederland, Colorado in early 2015. The 3-acre property backed up to national forest land and featured spectacular views of the Continental Divide. Eager to embrace authentic mountain living, they immediately began landscaping projects designed to attract wildlife and create a more natural environment around their home. The Crawfords planted 6 apple trees along their back property line and established an elaborate composting system near their garage. They installed bird feeders throughout their yard and created what Elaine described as wildlife corridors using native plants and berry bushes. Their suburban neighbors warned them about attracting bears, but the couple dismissed these concerns as exaggerated fears from less environmentally conscious residents. By September 2015, their apple trees had produced an abundant crop that began falling to the ground and fermenting in the warm autumn sunshine. Despite Dave's attempts to maintain proper composting techniques, the food scraps in the bins generated strong odors. Their golden retriever, Murphy, had begun displaying unusual behavior, frequently barking at night and refusing to go outside after dark. On the evening of September 24, 2015, Elaine heard Murphy barking frantically in their backyard around 11 o'clock. Looking through their kitchen window, she discovered a large black bear methodically working through the fallen apples beneath their trees. The animal appeared completely comfortable in their yard, occasionally standing on its hind legs to reach fruit from the lower branches. Dave's response demonstrated the dangerous overconfidence common among new mountain residents. Armed only with a household broom and convinced he could intimidate the bear into leaving, he opened their back door and began shouting while advancing toward the animal. The bear initially showed little concern about his presence, continuing to feed on the fermented fruit. When Dave approached within 10 feet and began striking the ground with his broom, the black bear's demeanor changed instantly. The animal spun around and charged, covering the distance between them in seconds. Dave fell backward trying to escape, and the bear immediately began mauling him in front of Elaine, who watched helplessly from their kitchen window. The attack focused on Dave's arms and torso as he attempted to defend himself. The bear's powerful jaws inflicted deep puncture wounds and lacerations across its upper body, while its claws tore through its clothing and skin. Elaine locked the doors and called 911, but the remote location meant emergency responders would require significant time to reach their property. For over an hour, Elaine provided medical assistance to her husband while waiting for help to arrive. She applied pressure to his wounds using towels and bedsheets, trying to control bleeding from the most serious injuries. Dave remained conscious throughout the ordeal, but had suffered severe damage to his left arm and shoulder, with visible bone fractures and torn muscle tissue. Emergency medical technicians stabilized Dave's condition and transported him to a community hospital in Boulder, where surgeons worked through the night to repair the extensive damage. Multiple operations were required to reconstruct his left arm, and despite successful treatment, he never regained full use of the limb. Physical therapy helped restore some function, but his engineering career effectively ended with the attack. Colorado parks and wildlife officials euthanized the bear the following day after tracking it to a nearby residential area. The decision sparked immediate controversy among animal rights activists, who argued that human behavior had created the dangerous situation. Local media coverage focused on the Crawfords as symbols of irresponsible development in wildlife habitat. Public criticism intensified when activists discovered the couple's extensive wildlife feeding activities and criticized their lack of proper bear-proofing measures. Elaine began receiving threatening calls and angry letters, forcing them to change their phone number and install security cameras around their property. The experience transformed their dream of mountain living into a nightmare of medical bills, legal issues, and public scrutiny. Elaine channeled her anger into advocacy work, launching a campaign to ban fruit trees and require bear-proof garbage containers in wildland-urban interface areas. Her efforts met resistance from property rights advocates, but gained support from wildlife officials struggling with increasing human-bear conflicts throughout Colorado. The attack fundamentally changed both their lives in ways that extended far beyond Dave's physical injuries. Elaine developed severe anxiety about wildlife and began sleeping with a loaded pistol on her nightstand. They never opened their windows after sunset and installed motion-activated lighting throughout their property. Their dream of mountain living had become a fortress mentality that isolated them from wildlife and their human neighbors. Dave eventually returned to limited consulting work, but struggled with chronic pain and reduced mobility in his injured arm. The couple considered selling their property, but discovered that news coverage of the attack had significantly reduced its market value. They remained trapped in a location that held only traumatic memories, surrounded by the same wildlife habitat that initially attracted them to Colorado's mountain communities. In the remote Canadian Arctic during March 2019, climate change research had become increasingly dangerous as traditional ice patterns became unpredictable and extreme weather events grew more frequent. The research station territory stretched across thousands of square miles of sea ice, tundra, and isolated islands where temperatures regularly dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Scientists working in these conditions faced the obvious challenges of extreme cold and the growing threat of displaced polar bears whose traditional hunting grounds were disappearing due to declining sea ice. Dr. Lena Vos, a 34-year-old glaciologist from a university in Calgary, had been conducting solo ice core research from a temporary field station approximately 200 kilometers north of Resolute Bay, Nunavut. Her work focused on analyzing ancient climate data trapped in Arctic ice formations, requiring her to operate sophisticated drilling equipment in one of the most isolated locations on Earth. The nearest permanent human settlement lay over 300 kilometers away, connected only by radio communications and occasional supply flights. Her field station consisted of an insulated research shelter, equipment storage pod, and emergency communications array powered by solar panels and a backup generator. The March research season had been plagued by unseasonably warm temperatures and unpredictable wind patterns, significantly shifting the local ice conditions from previous years. What should have been solid sea ice showed concerning signs of weakness and movement. On March 15, 2019, deteriorating ice conditions and shifting winds had effectively trapped Dr. Voss at her research location. The ice runway used by supply aircraft had become too unstable for safe landings, and weather forecasts indicated the situation would worsen before improving. Her satellite communication system had begun experiencing intermittent failures due to equipment damage from recent storms. During her third night alone at the compromised station, Dr. Voss noticed large tracks circling her shelter in the fresh snow. The prints measured nearly 12 inches across and showed a polar bear's distinctive shape and claw marks. The animal had been investigating her facility, following scent trails around the buildings and examining the equipment storage areas where food supplies were kept. Polar bear encounters in the research zone have increased dramatically over the past 5 years, as declining sea ice has forced the animals to travel greater distances in search of food. The bears are often emaciated and desperate, making them more dangerous to humans than well-fed animals with access to their traditional seal hunting grounds. Dr. Voss had completed extensive Arctic safety training, but her situation remained precarious due to her isolation and limited defensive options. On the night of March 18th, the polar bear approached her station more aggressively. The animal appeared to be a large male, possibly weighing over 800 pounds, despite showing signs of malnutrition. It began tearing at the insulation materials around her shelter walls, apparently attracted by food scents, or simply investigating the unusual structures in its territory. When the bear began directly assaulting her shelter, Dr. Voss fired an emergency flare through her window, creating a brilliant burst of light and sparks in the Arctic darkness. The polar bear retreated temporarily but returned within minutes, apparently undeterred by the pyrotechnic display. She then deployed her bear deterrent spray, but the -40-degree temperatures and strong winds rendered the chemical weapon ineffective. As the bear continued damaging her shelter's exterior walls, Dr. Voss locked herself inside the equipment storage pod and activated her emergency radio beacon. The storage unit's thick insulation and metal construction provided better protection than her main shelter. Still, she could hear the animal moving around the building, breathing heavily, and occasionally scraping at the walls with its massive claws. Dr. Voss remained trapped for 12 hours, while the polar bear maintained vigil around her station. The animal's behavior seemed more curious than immediately aggressive, but its massive size and obvious hunger made it extremely dangerous. She rationed her emergency food supplies and tried to conserve the battery power in her communication equipment while calling for rescue assistance. The bear's persistence suggested it had become fixated on her location, possibly due to the concentration of human scents and the presence of food storage areas. Arctic wildlife experts later explained that such behavior was becoming more common as climate change forced polar bears into increasingly desperate situations where they viewed any potential food source as worth investigating thoroughly. A search and rescue aircraft finally reached her location on March 19th, guided by her emergency beacon and weather reports indicating a brief window of improved flying conditions. The aircraft's engine noise caused the polar bear to retreat across the ice, allowing the rescue crew to extract Dr. Voss and her essential research data. Medical examination revealed she had suffered minor injuries from the cold and stress, but had avoided serious harm due to her preparation and the structural integrity of her equipment storage pod. However, the psychological impact of the extended encounter proved more lasting than her physical injuries. The experience of being stalked by a predator in complete isolation had created severe anxiety about returning to Arctic research conditions. Dr. Voss completed her analysis of the ice core samples from her laboratory in Calgary, but declined all subsequent opportunities for Arctic fieldwork. She transitioned to climate modeling research that could be conducted from university facilities, effectively ending a promising career in polar field science. Her research station was abandoned and later demolished by Canadian authorities due to the unstable ice conditions that had made her rescue necessary. The rescue operation proved challenging due to the deteriorating weather conditions and the bear's continued presence there. The rescue crew had to make multiple passes over the research station to ensure the polar bear had moved far enough away to attempt a safe landing. Ground visibility was severely limited by blowing snow, and the aircraft's skis barely found adequate purchase on the unstable ice surface during the emergency extraction. During the flight back to Resolute Bay, Dr. Voss detailed her ordeal to the rescue crew and later to Arctic wildlife officials. Her descriptions of the bear's behavior patterns and the extended duration of the encounter provided valuable data for researchers studying the impact of climate change on polar bear hunting strategies. The animal's persistent investigation of her research station suggested it had learned to associate human structures with potential food sources, a concerning adaptation in the changing Arctic environment. The incident highlighted growing safety concerns for Arctic researchers as climate change altered traditional wildlife patterns and made remote locations even more dangerous than in previous decades. Dr. Voss became an advocate for enhanced safety protocols and support systems for scientists working in polar regions, though she never returned to field research in bear country.